This video is sponsored by MCRU, manufacturers of the power cords and mains distribution blocks used by a British audiophile. For more information about these and their other products, please click the link in the description. My plan was to review the Denafrips Terminator 12th anniversary DAC, and because of all of the hoopla surrounding different Denafrips firmware options, report my findings on that as well. But then I thought, why not widen the remit of this video? I haven't done a guide to DACS in years, and there's so many options out there. Many devices have DACS fitted internally, but there are lots of external options as well. So yes, I want to let you know where I sit with the Denafrips Terminator and the different firmware options, but I want this video to primarily serve as my guide on how to choose a DAC. There are many instances where you don't need an external DAC because the one that you have inside your CD player, streamer or amplifier is perfectly suited to the task. I've just completed a review of the Bluesound Node X and the Eversolo DMP A6. Both are fitted with amongst some of the best ESS Sabre DAC chips available today. The Bluesound Node X, which retails for £699, has an internal DAC based around an ESS 9028 Q2M chip. And the £759 Eversolo DMP A6 has a fully balanced internal architecture based around two ESS 9038 Q2M chips. How good are their external DACs? Well, I'd wager they're as good as any sub £500 standalone DAC on the market. And as for amplifiers, if I had either of those streamers as my digital source, I wouldn't be looking for an external DAC to feed any amplifier in the sub £1,000 market. Couple the warm-sounding Bluesound Node X with the slightly lean-sounding but excellent IOTA VX SA3, and you have a very resolving but tonally balanced electronics package for just over £1,100. Similarly, the more forward and slightly bright Eversolo DMP A6 matches up superbly with the rounded sound of the Cambridge Audio AXA35. At £349, that amplifier remains one of the best bargains in hi-fi to this day. You just need to add speakers that float your boat and are relatively easy to drive, which should be the case as long as you stick to speakers in the sub £1,000 category. There are loads of options out there, but the objective ultimately should be to put together a system that suits your sonic preferences, where all the components gel together and there isn't one particular component that puts a bottleneck on performance. I've got some nice DACs as reference pieces. The Denafrips Ares 12-1 is a little over £1,000 and still my favourite at the price. The fully balanced R2R ladder DAC gives up a tiny bit of resolution to the best ESS and AKM based Delta Sigma DACs, but more than makes up for it in natural tone, soundstage width and depth. The Gustard R26 is an engineering marvel and the most resolving DAC I've heard below £2,000. Doesn't have the richness and scale of an equivalent Denafrips, but has plenty of three-dimensionality thanks to its R2R ladder topology. There was no way I was going to let the Denafrips Venus II go anywhere after I finished reviewing it. For a little over £3,000 it offers me everything I could expect: great resolution, natural tone, and the ability to lay out performers in front of you in a realistic manner. One of the big surprises for me has been that with a few of the amplifiers that I reviewed, I preferred their internal DACs to my reference DACs, even though I know that my reference DACs perform at a higher level in more resolving systems. Let me give you a few examples. The Audiolab 7008 offers great resolution for an amplifier that retails for £1,099. It has a DAC based around an ESS Sabre 9038 Q2M chip. The internal DAC is comfortably as good as the one inside the Bluesound Node X or the Eversolo DMP A6. Hooking up my Denafrips Venus II, which is about 3 times the price of this amplifier, gave some improvement in detail and soundstage, but that improvement was marginal, and it left me with a real appreciation of how good a job the internal DAC was doing. At £2,199 but regularly on sale for less than £2,000, the Marantz Model 40N is a big warm sounding amplifier. It has the HEOS streaming module and a DAC based around an ESS 9016 chip built in. Even though that chip's getting a little long in the tooth, I preferred the sound of the internal DAC to any of my reference DACs. Model 40N may not be the most resolving amplifier for the money, but it has a big personality and great dynamics which the internal DAC allowed to shine, while the external DACs that I connected in comparison sounded a little polite. I recently reviewed the Atoll Iron 300 that retails for £2,995. It's a beast of an amplifier, a dual mono design with a colossal power supply, and has an excellent internal DAC based upon the AKM AK4490 chip. It's another big warm sounding amplifier, but with more detail and control than the Marantz Model 40N. In fact, it'll make a nice alternative to my Hagel H190 for people who think that the Hagel perhaps plays things a little bit too safe. And I did connect up my Denafrips Venus II to it, which offered a little bit more detail and scale, but overall I preferred the internal DAC. It just had better tonal balance, and it did something that very few chip-based DACs have done in my experience: offer soundstage depth. Here's the thing, if the designer has done his job correctly, and the internal DAC has enough resolution not to place a limit on the performance of the amplifier, but more importantly plays to the strengths of the amplifier and masks some of its weaknesses, it's likely to sound better than a fancier external DAC. So by going for an external DAC, you may just be throwing your money away. Naturally, there are scenarios where you're going to need an external DAC. Not all amplifiers have an internal DAC. There are purist amplifiers out there as well. Whilst with amplifiers below £1,000, I'm almost always likely to stick with the internal DAC either fitted to the amplifier, the streamer or the CD player. That isn't the case when I step up to £2,000. It's the natural tone, layering of soundstage, as well as the detail and refinement that makes the Exposure 2510 such a beguiling amplifier to listen to. Those qualities need to be preserved with the rest of the equipment if you want to get the best out of the 2510. As good as the Eversolo DMP A6 is, it doesn't have the refinement or scale to deliver the goods if you're relying on its internal DAC. The Bluesound Node X may have the scale, but doesn't have the resolution, and also has too much sonic coloration to rely upon the DAC that it has fitted in situ. It's a similar story when switching to my other reference amplifier below £2,000. The Wilsonton R8 with pierce vein tubes trades a little bit of the 2510's refinement for greater scale and dynamics, which makes it an overall equally capable amplifier in my book. To get the best out of those two amplifiers, I have to get the streamers to up their game. The best way to do that is to use them as a transport and connect an external DAC of sufficient quality to the USB output of the streamers. There are plenty of DACs that will give you the detail and refinement. But if you desire a natural tone and decent spatial abilities, I haven't come across anything that will outperform a Denafrips Ares 12-1 for circa £1,000. There are levels to this game, and though ultimately I demand more performance from my digital front end as I move into more expensive and resolving systems, I could live with the Eversolo DMP A6 or the Bluesound Node X as a streaming transport feeding into the Denafrips Ares 12-1 in any of my reference setups. And I couldn't say that about the streamers if they were in stock form. My Hagel H190 retails for a little over £3,000, and I'm all too aware of what it brings to the party over the Wilsonton R8 and the Exposure 2510 that I consider to occupy the class below. There's a little bit more detail but significantly more scale and control. The H190 has a lot more power and a much higher damping factor. It really shows up when it comes to bass control. The Denafrips Ares 12-1 works fine but has certain limitations when it comes to controlling the bass. It shows up and ultimately prevents the Hagel from truly doing its thing. Extra detail and greater bass control is exactly what the Gustard R26 offers over the Denafrips Ares 12-1, even though the soundstage is a touch narrower. The Hagel H190 is capable enough to reveal the additional scale, acoustic richness and finesse that the Denafrips Venus II offers over the R26. But almost twice the price of the Gustard, I can't advise anyone to lay out over £3,000 on a DAC to pair with an amplifier at a similar price. And that's why the Denafrips Venus II ultimately finds its home with my vintage Exposure 21 Pre and 18 Super monoblocks. Now, I don't believe in upgrading in bite sizes, but most of us have to be sensible when it comes to spending money on upgrades. So there's no point in shelling out loads of money just to squeeze a little bit of extra performance. As I've said earlier in this video, Ultimately, the aim is to get everything in your system to perform at a similar level. There are 3 versions of firmware available for the range of Denafrips DACS, the original firmware. The firmware that was offered in the summer of 2022 that a lot of people objected to, and the current firmware. Now, this firmware was offered to Denafrips customers free of charge, and I have to commend the global distributor Alvin and his team at Vinshine Audio. It's tied them up for months. The firmware upgrading process isn't straightforward. For Windows PCs, you need to download a couple of pieces of software that allow you to download the USB driver and configure the driver. You also need to go through a reboot procedure. It bypasses a security feature on Windows that checks the signature of all drivers that are allowed to be installed. You can then finally follow the online instructions that allow you to update the firmware, but make sure you choose the right firmware for the FPGA chip fitted inside your DAC. Install the wrong one and the DAC will be rendered useless. If in doubt, take the lid off your DAC and send a photo of the FPGA chip installed inside the DAC to Vinshine Audio for confirmation. You can see the 3 firmware options available for my Venus II here. Version 1.0 is the original, version 3.3 is the one launched in the summer, and version 3.5 is the current version. Well, how do they sound? Actually quite different. Version 3.3, which is the one launched in the summer, is a lot cleaner than the original. But it also changes the tonal character of the DAC. The bass is lighter and there's less weight in the mid-range. I can see why people who like the sound of the original DAC objected to it. As for the latest version, version 3.5, again, that's cleaner than the original as well, but not quite as clean or as analytical sounding as version 3.3. But it has the tonality of the original, and it's the one that most Denafrips owners are going to be happy with. Now, before I move on, I have a little bit of a bone to pick with Denafrips. In the last couple of months, they've launched updated versions to their Pontus 12th anniversary and their Venus 12th anniversary with minor power supply tweaks. The 12-1 models replaced the 12th anniversary models that themselves only came out less than a year ago. I have the Denafrips Venus II, which itself is only 18 months old. For it to be replaced and then replaced again in such a short space of time is just ridiculous. I also have the Venus 12th anniversary here to compare to my Venus II. The main difference between those two DACs is that the 12th anniversary model has bigger O-ring transformers, growing from 60 VA to 80 VA. But do they sound different? Not as far as I can tell. For Denafrips to launch yet another model by gold plating some screws, the AC inlet filter and making some minor power supply tweaks, I think is short-sighted. I really like the team at Vinshine Audio. I think Alvin and his team have done a fantastic job of building the global reputation of Denafrips and are very straightforward to deal with. But if Denafrips are going to launch new models every 6 months, I can only see that as hurting the brand and aggravating existing customers. At £4,600 in the UK, the Denafrips Terminator 12th anniversary is £1,500 more expensive than the Venus 12-1. If you're judging by weight or the real estate it takes up, you'll certainly feel that you've got your value for money. It's not that it's a full rack width unit weighing 19 kilograms, that's £42, but it has a footprint that's bigger than my Hagel H190, and that's an amplifier that can deliver some juice. It barely fits on my rack. In fact, I have to angle it to accommodate some of the cables that hang off the back. Analog outputs are identical to the Venus with balanced XLR and single-ended RCA, but the digital connections vary. The Terminator has a couple of master clock inputs and additional I2S inputs to offer greater upgradability to use with external clocks and DDCs. The Terminator has a bigger power supply with much larger bank of capacitors to keep impedance down and ensure that voltages feeding circuits remain stable. Interestingly, the R2R ladder network of the Terminator seems identical to the Venus with the same number of resistors. It's a truly balanced 26-bit architecture made up of 0.005% precision resistors. A significant difference between the Venus and the Terminator is the quality of the clock. The Venus 12th has temperature compensating crystal oscillators to ensure a stable output. The Terminator 12th has oven controlled crystal oscillators to ensure an even more stable output from the clock. That's the encased device that you can see. What you want from a crystal oscillator is a stable output regardless of the temperature. The problem is that temperatures do change inside DACS that affect the output of the crystal oscillator. The Venus II has crystal oscillators that compensate for this by having a little thermistor circuit, whereas the Terminator, well, that encases the crystal oscillators in a bath, trying to prevent those temperature changes in the first place. Enough about that. Time to talk about how it sounds. The best way I can think of describing the Terminator 12th is lots of subtle improvements in key areas of performance over the Venus 12th that add up to an increase in clarity and focus. The most obvious difference was in terms of soundstage and imaging. Yeah, the soundstage was a little bit wider, but it was noticeably deeper, and the locations of performers in the mix was more secure. The bass was also a little bit tighter, and because of that better instrument separation, it was easier to track individual performers in the mix. Things like cymbal decays also had a touch more refinement. Now, this is in the context of my vintage exposure pre-mono and ProAct system, and as I mentioned in this video, context is everything. In more expensive systems performing at higher levels, I'm talking about speakers and amplifiers retailing for perhaps £10,000 or more, the differences between the Venus and the Terminator would become even more apparent. But in my system, the differences between the different firmware options with the Venus were more apparent than the differences between the Venus and the Terminator. That's not saying anything against the Terminator. It's an excellent sounding DAC. In fact, the best sounding DAC that I've heard to date, but it was living up to expectations as opposed to exceeding them. Time to wrap things up. So where am I at with the Denafrips Terminator 12th anniversary? Is it the best sounding DAC that you can buy on the market for this side of £5,000? Possibly, but it's always difficult to make those kind of assertions, and I'd be a little bit more comfortable if I'd reviewed a couple of other contenders, the Chord Hugo TT and the Holo Audio May. Neither of those I'm going to get my hands on until they revise those models, which I don't think will happen anytime soon. So that leaves me with the Terminator. It's the best sounding but also the most expensive DAC that I've reviewed to date. I'm very happy to give it a highly recommended, but with a proviso, I can amend that rating further down the line if I need to. But the remit of this video was wider than reviewing the Denafrips Terminator 12th anniversary DAC. It was to share with you my processes when it comes to choosing a DAC in the hope that it may help you in some of your decision making. Now, that brings me nicely onto the question for today. Please share in the comments section, what is your process for choosing a DAC? I think it'll make for a very interesting discussion. All that remains for me to say is if you like this video, if you like what I'm doing with this channel, you want to see it grow, and you haven't done so already, please like, share, subscribe, hit the bell notification. Check me out on Patreon. There's a couple of consultancy tiers you can access there if you think I can help you on your audiophile journey. Also check out the ABA Club on Patreon, which has some great ways to interact with me and fellow Patreons. But for today, for now, a British audiophile, signing off.